Hello again. In this session, I'm going to take you to some Federal Reserve sites that have some pretty interesting economic analysis. In general, I recommend using Federal Reserve sites because the analysis there tends to be objective. The Fed doesn't have any particular axe to grind or political agenda, unlike many other web pages that you could go to. And also, the Fed provides a lot of useful data. So let's start by going to the Minneapolis Fed. This was an analysis that I stumbled across a few days ago. If we go to this site, we see over here Recession in Perspective. And what's interesting about this is it shows you the comparison of the current recession to past recessions in the United States, looking either at employment, as up here, or output, as down here. So if we click on Compare Recessions, and for now let's get rid of 1981. Down here you see you can click on any of the recessions we've had in the post-World War II period. The red line is the current recession, the green line is the 2001 recession, and what this records is the change in the percentage change in employment this many months after the start of the recession. And what jumps out at you is that in the current recession, employment remains well below where it was at the beginning of the recession. 2001 was also referred to as a jobless recovery, but what you can see here is that while both recessions started for about the first year looking very similar in terms of employment losses, in 2001 it kind of flattened out. I mean, there's a little bit of a decline here, but in under 3 years employment had started to grow, and after about 4 years employment was back to where it was before the recession hit, and then it grew after that. In contrast, if you look at this recession, even 51 months after the beginning of the recession, we are still, in terms of unemployment, almost 4% below where we were at the start. So it's clear that this recession, in terms of employment loss, is much more persistent than, say, the 2001. And that contrast shows up even more starkly if we start looking at, this includes 1990 recession, the 81 recession. The 81 recession is interesting because it was very sharp, as you can see, but within about 18 months employment started to pick up, and a little more than 2 years after the beginning of the recession, employment was beyond where it was before. So now we just go back and look at other recessions, and what you see here is in all these cases employment recovered much more quickly than it's recovering in the current recession. So if we look at this one, this is the 1957 recession, you can see that in the short run it was much sharper. The employment loss was much more rapid than it has been during this recession. But after about 9 months, it had started to grow again, and within 18 months, it was back above its starting point. Now you can go through a similar analysis looking at recessions in terms of output rather than employment, and you'll see something similar happening, but it's not quite as pronounced as in the case of employment. Now, if you look at, say, length of recessions, that's another tab that's available. You can compare the length of recessions, the current one relative to other post-war recessions, and depth of recessions too. This is giving you what the total change in employment is, again, this many months after the peak. And you can see that in all of these previous recessions, 51 months after the peak, employment had grown, and that's not true of the current recession. Now, of course, employment did fall in these other recessions, and we just have to scoot back the number of months after the peak to see where those declines occurred. This is a little ornery. So now you can see that what happened to employment over time in these other recessions. And you can do a similar sort of analysis with output. Now, another interesting analysis that I stumbled across is at the Cleveland Fed. So if we go to the Cleveland Fed's webpage, what we see here is this credit easing policy tools. And this is an interesting graph because what it shows is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. In normal times, so that's up until about the middle of 2008, the Fed's balance sheet consisted primarily of two things. One was holdings of Treasury securities. That's what they call traditional security holdings. And these tended to be short-term Treasury bills, 3-month, 6-month Treasury bills. And then this little wedge here is direct lending to financial institutions, so that could be through the Fed's discount window. And so those are loans to banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System, and those loans are made at the discount rate. But then what happened? Starting in the middle of 2008, so this is before the crisis really hit, the Fed started lending more and more to financial institutions. And at the same time, in order to keep the size of its total balance sheet unchanged, it got rid of these Treasury holdings. But then the crisis started to hit, and now we're talking about the time of Lehman Brothers and other crises that were occurring in the U.S. And now suddenly these loans, this is liquidity that the Fed provided to credit markets, shot way up. The Fed's balance sheet more than doubled in size. And at the same time, these lending to financial institutions increased. So that went along for a little while, and then in the beginning, early 2009, the Fed started these unusual operations. And so these are, as you can see, federal agency debt, mortgage-backed security purchases. And these are the unusual operations that the Fed engaged in during the crisis. And these operations were massive. So here we are in the middle of 2010, and you can see the size of these operations. And the Fed's balance sheet continued to grow even more. Until now, it's about triple what it was before the crisis hit. Now there's one other part of this yellow region that is also unusual. It's kind of like an Operation Twist that occurred in the 1960s. What the Fed decided to do was to take on more long-term treasuries, and that's what this vertical distance tells you. And you can see that now the Fed is holding a great many long-term treasuries. Now, what were they trying to do with that? Well, the idea was if the Fed went in and bought these long-term treasury bills from institutions that were holding them, this would drive up the price of these long-term treasuries, which would then, because interest rates and these security prices are inversely related, this would drive down long-term interest rates. So this was part of the Fed's strategy to try to stimulate the economy, was to reduce long-term interest rates. And they did that by taking these long-term treasuries out of the hands of the public and holding them on the Fed's balance sheet. So you can mess around with the dates here, and you can see what was happening in real time if you want. And then this tab gets you to the actual data that you can download into an Excel file or something if you wish to do something with the data. So the last thing I want to do is go to the Federal Reserve Board's webpage. What I want to recommend to you is that Chairman Ben Bernanke gave a series of college lectures at George Washington University, and the video of these lectures is available on this page. So the 4 lectures are Origins and Mission of the Federal Reserve. So this will go into talking about the financial crises that occurred in the U.S. before the Fed was created, what life was like on the gold standard, etc. Then the second lecture is about what the Fed has been doing over the period since World War II. Third lecture focuses very much on the Fed's response to this current financial crisis, and that will get into a lot of detail about why the Fed's balance sheet exploded in the way that we just saw from the Cleveland Fed's webpage. Then the final lecture is the aftermath of the crisis. Now the neat thing about this, there's a reading list here you can go to, and if you go to the specific lectures, so here's where you play the video, but you'll also see that you can get a transcript in PDF format, or you can look at the slides that Bernanke used during his courses. And so you can actually just follow along with these slides while you listen to the video if you wish. Now these are fairly long, they're about an hour each, so it's a pretty substantial investment in time, but I think you would learn a lot from it, and I very much recommend it. Okay, that's it for looking at Federal Reserve information on the internet. You can go to any Federal Reserve bank that you wish, and you'll find that there's all kinds of interesting information available to you.